Hi again. So this should be the second video that you're watching. So this is then should be the next page in your packet after the AC method. So this is where we're looking at, why we did everything with factoring so that we can solve a quadratic by factoring. So we've got this example here where we've got a quadratic equaling to 2. So at this point, if we want to solve this, you would have to put, before we're doing what we're doing now, you would put the left side into y1 and then you put the right side into y2 and see where they cross. So to do this algebraically, the first thing that we're going to do is, in order to solve this one by factoring, we have to get everything on one side. So we're going to subtract that 2 over. So I'm going to bring everything to one side. I'm going to end up getting x squared minus 7x. And when you subtract that 2 over, you end up going to get negative 18 equals 0. So the first step is to get everything on one side, or get one side equal to 0. Okay, so you have to rearrange terms. Whoops, sorry about that. That was supposed to be the erase. So you're going to have to rearrange terms in order to get one side equal to 0. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to, using whatever method depending on, if it's 4 terms, we'll use grouping. If it's the leading coefficient is a 1, we'll use trial and error. If it's a more complicated one, we'll use AC method. So we're going to factor the quadratic, or I'm just going to say the polynomial, just because this would work even if it wasn't a quadratic. Okay, so if I factor that one, the GCF for all those terms, there's nothing to pull out of all the terms. And since the leading coefficient is a 1, it's very easy for me to just come up with my factors. Notice it still equals 0. I didn't drop that equation. So I would need an x and an x. I'm thinking of numbers that multiply to 18, a negative 18, and combine to a 7. So the numbers are 9 and 2, the 9 being negative, the 2 being positive. That will combine to a negative 7x. If you check it, you could always take a minute right here and check that factoring to make sure it works. Okay, so the next thing we do here, let me tell you what we're going to do, and then I'll explain why we do it, is we're going to set each factor equal to 0. Okay, so it's going to look like this. X minus 9. A lot of times people skip this step, and you definitely do not want to do that. So I set each factor to 0. Let me just draw a line down here so you can see my steps versus my work. Okay, so the reason I'm able to do that is because if I look at these two factors right here, if I multiply two things and I'm saying we get a 0 out, just think about when you multiply. If you ever multiply two things and get a 0, one of those things had to have been a 0 to begin with. Okay, that's the only way you could get a 0 by multiplication. So if x minus 9 times x plus 2 equals 0, then either x minus 9 is 0 or x plus 2 is 0. One of those has to be equal to 0. So now that we do this, we've got two really easy linear equations. We took a quadratic and we wrote it as a product of two linear factors, and now we can solve this. So we're going to add over the 9. So I get x equals 9, and I subtract over the 2, and I get x equals negative 2. So I'm just subtracting over to the 2 there. So a lot of times people skip that and just try to come up with the answers from when they factors, and they kind of memorize, oh, we changed the sign of the number. Don't do that. All you want to really do is set each factor to 0 and solve the equation. So that's our last step here. We solve each of those equations. Okay, so we have two answers. X could either be 9 or x could be negative 2. Okay, so we would have gotten two answers if we had done this graphically as well. So let's try a couple examples down here. Move this up a little bit. Alright, so let's try the same thing. So we've got 5x squared minus 10x. I wanted to do this one because it has only two terms, and even though this really should be a lot easier, a lot of times people make it harder than it is. So the first thing I'm going to do is I need everything on one side. So I'm going to subtract over that 10x to get one side to be 0. I always really want my squared term to be positive. So since the 5x squared was positive, I brought the 10x over to join it so I didn't mess it up. You're going to see in the next video where I have a leading term being negative, And I rearrange everything just so I can make it positive because it makes it much easier to factor. So this one right here, it only has two terms, and when I go to look to take out the GCF is 5x, okay? So I'm not really unfoiling, I only really have to undistribute. So watch what happens. When I take out 5x, I end up with x minus 2, okay? So this piece right here, this x minus 2, it's not a quadratic anymore, so there's no more factoring I could do with that. So I do have two factors. 5x is a factor, and x minus 2 is a factor. So I'm going to set 5x equal to 0, just like I did on the example above, and I'm going to set x minus 2 equal to 0. Alright, so this one's always an easier one. I'll do that one first. So we know x could be 2, that's one answer. I should always get two answers out of these quadratics. So the value that comes out of here is, well, just solve it. If you solve this one, you divide out to 5, you get x to be 0. So I have two answers. X could be either 0 or x could be 2 to make that work. So I have to get 2. Anytime I actually factor out an x like I did in this one, 0 is always going to be one of my values. Alright, let's try this last one on this page. So I've got to rearrange some things. So I'm going to leave the 2p squared, and I'm going to bring over the p, and I'm going to subtract over the 5. So let me just fix that a little bit. So what I'm end up doing is I'm subtracting over this p to both sides, so they drop there, and I'm going to subtract over the 5. So what's it end up going to be, it's going to look like this, 2p squared. We're going to end up having minus 9p minus 5. Okay, so the majority of this problem is going to be spent with us just working on the factoring. Okay, so let me go down below. Let me just work on that down here, okay, so you can just see what I'm doing. I'm going to do the AC method. And so my AC is negative 10. So I need two numbers that multiply to negative 10 and combine to a negative 9. So negative 10 and 1 is what's going to work. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite it as 2p squared minus 10p plus p minus 5. And then I'm going to use grouping. So I'm going to get 2p. I'm going to pull out a 2p there and get p minus 5. And now the only thing I can pull out of that is a 1 and get p minus 5. So my factored form of this is 2p plus 1 times p minus 5. Alright, so now I'll come back up and put this back up here, now that I've done my factoring. 2p plus 1 times p minus 5 equals 0. Okay, because I'm solving this one. So now I'm going to set each factor to 0. There's first, and here's the second one. So this one, the right one's much easier because I add 5 over and get p to be 5. Alright, for the second one, let's just do the work out. I'm going to subtract the 1 over, so I get 2p equals negative 1. That's just me doing this. I'm going to divide out the 2. So I get p to be negative 1/2. That's okay, that's not whole. We've gotten many that were not whole. So those are my two values for p for that quadratic. If I were graphing these, that would be, if I were graphing the parabola right here, you know, the 2p squared minus 9p minus 5, this is where it would cross the x-axis. I'm getting my horizontal intercepts when I'm doing this. Okay, so you have one more video after this with just a couple more examples. One, we're going to go back to the very front page of the packet. So keep the packet out, and the next video we'll start with the front of that.